my goodness. Oh, um, all right. Doug, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for making the connection to the BTS Center. And I don't know why I hesitated over the weekend to say yes to this. It was just like, oh, I have to teach these students and, nerves. I'm really glad to be back again this morning. Everybody doing okay? We're a little revved up, caffeinated. Okay, so today is the experimental, I don't know what I'm talking about talk. And I'm going to put a bunch of ideas out there, and I'm really eager for your thoughts, your response. I'll see a little bit by what's on your faces. But I also welcome you to send me emails, if you reflect on something afterwards and think, I have a really good idea, or yes, that really hit with my faith community. All that is very welcome. As I mentioned yesterday, my husband and I are trying to think about this, next book, Refugee at Church. And my plan is really to let BTS Center do all the work, and then I'll just write it up. So they know that. Yeah. So we're back to this question. Yeah. Yeah. Yay. Okay. We're back to this question. So what? We've got this lovely idea, this beautiful metaphor. It's a very generative metaphor. So now what? What does it actually look like if we imagine ourselves? This is about imagining our way into a new way of thinking about faith communities and the life of faith. What if we imagine ourselves as people of Refugia? What is that going to look like? So there we go. I think the first thing we have to do is honor the moment that we're in and be honest about it. And we started to do that yesterday. I thought you would enjoy a slide of Reformation iconoclasty. This is how it feels, doesn't it? And this is actually, I'm a scholar of the British literature during the time of the Reformation, which feels entirely irrelevant to what I'm doing now. And yet it's not, because that was another time when people's worlds were falling apart around them in every way, but in particular, their religious worlds were falling apart around them during the Reformation. And for all these years, I've studied that period, read the literature, written articles and books and things. And it's all very interesting and fascinating, but I haven't, I admit, thought a lot about what it must have felt like to live through this and how painful it was and upsetting it was. Now, admittedly, we don't usually burn people at the stake these days, but sometimes it feels there's still a lot of violence. It's just in other ways. And there's still a lot of grief and uncertainty, and we're all feeling that. And I think it might be helpful just to remember that this is not the first time that people have felt this kind of upheaval, including in their religious worlds. There were economic and political issues too, very much so. So I wanted to quote from one of my colleagues, Jamie Smith. He's a philosopher, and he's written a beautiful book called How to Inhabit Time. I think it's going to be kind of a classic. It's a little bit hard to read just because it's very dense, and he's a philosopher, right? He's not an English major. Yeah. So you do your best, right? But sorry, Jamie. He would laugh, and he would say the same thing. But he's been thinking a lot about what it means to understand your place in history. And he's especially concerned with religious people who are so obsessed either with nostalgia or with a kind of lurid eschatology, which happens a lot in the United States for sure. So his thinking is we want to be honest and wise about the moment that we're in. So I love both these quotes. Recognizing our embeddedness in the vicissitudes, spell that one, of history's contingent twists and turns is only half the work. The other half is knowing how to inherit. I think that's a really evocative phrase. What to do with what we've been given. This is the work of discernment. I think that's what we're trying to do right now. We have this religious heritage. It's varied. Each of us has different pieces of it. What do we do with that right now? And he always comes back to Augustine. I can just tell you, he always comes back to Augustine. So he recommends what he calls a historical Augustinianism, a graced temporality. I told you, in which the spirit is afoot and on, and we by grace are invited to join and thereby both be transformed and be part of the unfolding transformation. And I like a bunch of things about that. Number one, we're not engineering it. What a relief. God is engineering this. The spirit of the divine is engineering this. But we need to be attentive to that and join in. And that's going to require a transformation of us too, as we assist in this divine transformation. So I love this sense that we don't have to wring our hands, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. We have to make this happen. I mean, yes, it feels like we're doing things and that's good, but that sense that resting in this bigger work, I think that's part of honoring our time as well. Okay, so here's my wild theory. And I feel like I read this somewhere. And if any of you can tell me where I read this, could you please let me know? Because I can't find it. Yeah. Oh, a different mic. Oh yeah, now we're talking. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, is this better? Yeah, okay. I'll try to get a little bit closer. Whoa. Okay. Try to get closer and not breathe. So I wonder if we can think of the sort of tradition of Christian theology in several eras. So the first era is at that pointy top, figuring out the nature of God. So those of you who've been to seminary, a lot of you have been to seminary, you know, you get this Church History 101, and it's kind of Heretics Hall of Fame. And the first period of history, the councils of Nicaea, the first 300 to 400 years of Christian history, had a lot to do with the nature of God, the Trinity, who is Christ, you know, who is this person? That was the sort of theological work. I know this is ridiculously reductive, but stay with me. And then the next period of history, here, I'm actually going to do this again, because I think oh, look at me. Yeah, there we go. I learned so many things making this PowerPoint show. The next period of history, I'm thinking about the Reformation now. The big question was, what is up with atonement? And I'm not saying it all happened in 1500, although I will point out that John Calvin was born in 1509. The work of this was, okay, let's work out this whole salvation thing. So how does grace fit in? How does merit fit in? And that was the sort of theological obsession of that period of time. So we're running down that left-hand side of the triangle here, the relationship of God and humans. You can see where this is going. Now, I wonder if we're trying to close the triangle and work on the relationship of God, humans, and the earth. And I'm not saying that all started in 1960. In fact, the more I think about it, the more, although I don't know, stuff went down in 1960. But I wonder if this was actually being worked on in the Western Enlightenment too, except badly. So Enlightenment eco-theology is pretty terrible. Poor Descartes, he always gets blamed for it, and he kind of deserves it. But I wonder if this is what's going on right now. So there's this ferment of eco-theology, people thinking about this. And I'm not saying theology is the only issue here. We are pushed on by a lot of things, you know, and theology is never, this might come as a surprise, but it's never just abstract up here. It's always interested in what's going on. It's always influenced by what's going on. So there are reasons, of course, why we're working on this right now. We kind of have to, and it's good. So we're rethinking our relationship with the MTHC. The MTHC is the more than human creation. So I teach my students that long phrase in class, and they start to shorten it to the MTHC. So we just, the MTHC. Um, it's a lot easier to type than all the hyphens and more than human creation. So I think this is really our central theological task right now, to rethink our relationship, God, humans, creation, the triangle. And in the book, that's really transformation 2, this transformation from alienation to kinship. We've heard that word a lot. Many of you have read Robin Wall Kimmerer, her emphasis on reciprocity. I mean, she's not explicitly doing Christian theology, but she kind of is. Sorry, Robin Wall Kimmerer. So this calling back to people of faith to remember our kinship with each other, with all fellow creatures of God. And to note, it was, as you were just saying, Nicole, nature reminds us that diversity is strength and resilience. I was just talking to Frank, right? Frank, about forest management and the need to have, what did you call it, a mosaic? A shifting mosaic, right? The sense that nature likes a portfolio strategy. So if we think about that as a wonderful wisdom to guide us too. So this work of reminding and remembering, and I say that because I think it's something we knew and we've forgotten. So there's a lot of theologians looking back to the Old Testament and saying, oh yeah, this is written by indigenous people who were close to the land. And even the New Testament, these are written by people who are close to the land. They understand their kinship. It's we who've forgotten it. So in some sense, we have to go back, but in another sense, we have to move forward with the scientific knowledge we have that is definitely affirming all of that traditional ecological knowledge, if I can call it that, of our shared biological life, and we would say our shared belovedness in God. And we're seeing that work happen, and I think it needs to be expanded and continued. Oops, I went the wrong way. There we go. Okay, here's a very nutty slide. So what is that theological shift? I'm sorry, but Reformed people just love to talk about theology. So let's get practical. What does that mean for ecclesiology? Oops, that's just another category of theology. But ecclesiology is the theological reflection on the nature and purpose of the church. So that word ecclesia means called out, out, called out. But is that really the right word for us now? Called out? There's this sense of separation, hence our ridiculous circles here. Because I wonder if we sometimes think of our faith groups as their own little sphere, and they kind of overlap education and family, but they don't necessarily overlap other stuff that much, depending on your tradition. In any case, we have our spiritual businessy stuff, and other spheres do other things. So if you're interested in Dutch theology, we could talk about Doyweird here, but let's not. Nobody can spell it anyway. So I wonder if sometimes we think that religious communities have their sort of lane, their sphere, their lane, and some people are more or less comfortable with getting out of that lane. And that's the way we've sort of organized our lives. So I think what we need here is a quote from Thomas Berry, the great Catholic ecologian. Geologian. Yeah, thank you, Eddie called himself. At this point, at this moment in history, remember we're trying to live into this moment of history, all human institutions, professions, programs, and activities, all must now be judged primarily by the extent to which they inhibit, ignore, or foster a mutually enhancing human-earth relationship. So he's putting every human institution, profession, program, and activity, including our faith institutions and our faith lives, under that heading. So I wonder if instead of the nice little spheres that may or may not intersect, oh yeah, I want to go back and just point out, not to scale, not even a little. Yeah. But I wonder if it's better now to think once again about ecological systems and think of our faith communities as nodes in a big network. And it used to be we had networks within our denominations with other similar faith communities. And those networks, I don't know about your experience, but the ones I know are breaking down from conflict. And I think what we're doing in this room right now is creating new networks. We're making new lines on a diagram like this. But it's not just faith communities. Faith communities are nodes in a bigger social fabric. And all of those lines, there's no more spheres Venn diagram kind of thing. What if we thought of ourselves as part of this whole social ecosystem, and we have a role to play as faith communities, and we have to make all those meshy connections with other spheres in ways that we've been, trying to deliver religious goods and services, but maybe we need to connect in other ways. And some people do that more than others now, but maybe we have to think about what we do as nodes in this big social fabric. And our job is to draw all those little lines. I wanted to share with you this beautiful artwork by my retired colleague, Joanne van Riewijk. I know Dutch names, right? All the vowels. Joanne has been really interested in the whole refugia idea too, and she loved this word soliphilia. I was talking about this with somebody. Who was that? I was talking about this word with just yesterday. Soliphilia is one of these words made up by the Australian philosopher Glenn Albrecht. And the idea is it's the love of a place that compels you to heal it. And my colleague just loved that. And so she did this whole series of artworks that she's thinking of this as a neural network or a mycelium underground. And isn't it interesting where you can find these sort of networky patterns in nature? So there's a whole series of beautiful art. So just a reminder, if refugia are nature's strategy for resilience, and this is a slide you saw yesterday, and this moment demands mitigation and adaptation, and we have to become resilient healers. Okay, so this is our question again. How do we do this? If we're thinking of faith communities as nodes in a network, building, rebuilding, and healing a social fabric, okay, what do we do? Well, I'll remind you again, it's really important to remember that small is not insignificant. We're going to expand this in a minute, but small is not insignificant. So I'm reminding you of the mustard seed, Jesus' parable of the mustard seed about the kingdom, the reign, the kingdom of God. And here's another thing to remember. Refugia in the natural world are often low resource spaces. That's the point. Refugia presume disturbance. And honestly, they don't always work. And I think it's important to remember that too. They are not necessarily the no-fail solution to everything. Sometimes they just fail. Sometimes they die. But they are often low resource spaces. And I think that's a good reminder too. We don't have to get gigantic grants from the Lilly Foundation to create refugia. Although if you want some, they're probably out there. And you know what I'm talking about. If you want to feed people, yeah, or travel, they don't pay for equipment. There are advantages to being small. And I know this is a real issue for New England mainline churches. What do? We don't have 3 chancel choirs, and we don't have lots of kids under age 50. I know. But there are advantages to being small. And remember, refugia are often small, and they're often low resource. In a minute, we're going to realize I think we have more resources than we think. But if you're small, you're more nimble, fewer committees to get, run things by. You have less to lose, less to maintain and less to lose. And you know how churches struggle sometimes with a gigantic building and the gigantic organ that some donor donated in 1920 and now it needs repair and right? If you have less to maintain and lose, you are more nimble. and you're more ready to experiment. And I think because we're in this moment of upheaval, we have to be willing to experiment and try things. And I see it happening. You're probably doing it. And that's good. That's exactly what we should be doing. And it's fine to do nutty stuff that in the end you think, yeah, that was not great. It's fine. So I think what we have to do is follow Jamie Smith's advice and discern our gifts as faith communities. And this is, I've been thinking about this, and the BTS staff has been thinking about this. And I think this is going to be a really important part of the next book. I want to encourage us all to remember we have more assets than we think we do. And one of our assets is, believe it or not, faith itself. We have to remember that. That is one of the unique things we offer in this great work that we share in that node, in that network of nodes, rebuilding the social fabric, healing the social fabric for a new moment. So by faith itself, I mean a lot of things, but in essence, this big narrative of hope. And hope, that means we act rightly, we show up faithfully, and not in a utilitarian fashion. Like we only do things that are actually going to work and bring ROI and, you know, allow us to plot data on a chart that moves upward from left to right. We do what's right because it's right, despite the outcome. And even without knowing that it's going to work, so to speak. Do the next right thing, yeah? And this sense of transcendence. So I think this is especially important for people who are working really, really hard in all kinds of advocacy areas. And they get exhausted because things seem to move so incrementally and so slowly. But we need this sense of transcendence because, as John Calvin says, we have this sensus divinitatus, you know, we have this sense of the numinous, the sense of God, a sense of something beyond this material world, or something that infuses this material world. And we post-Enlightenment moderns tend to struggle with that. But we, as people of faith, are the stewards of that transcendence, or we can be. People need spiritual depth at a time of great anxiety, upheaval, and suffering. And this is especially true of young people. This is that PRRI survey I think I mentioned yesterday. And what you're seeing there, I think, is astonishing. I know that it's very tiny. The blue stuff on the right, those are white evangelical Protestants, white mainline non-evangelical Protestants, and white Catholics. And you'll see that each of those segments in the United States is now 13%. Isn't that interesting? That big old purple segment, that's unaffiliated. And the headline, as I mentioned yesterday, is how much that purple part is growing and how much the white evangelicals is shrinking. So it feels from the media in the United States that white evangelicals are all there is. And all the green stuff is Christians of color. So that all adds up to another good 20%, more than 20%, 25%. All right. So what can we offer? A sense of transcendence, meaning making. So Nicole, you were talking about that the other day, meaning making, the stories we tell. I think, you know, believe it or not, we're also actually good at community, or at least we have experience. We're not always good at it. Yeah, I know. There's murmurs in the room. But Christine, what do you want to add here? But we have patterns, we have practices. And I think one of the things we have to treasure that traditionally we've been actually good at is intergenerational community. Yeah. Mutual aid networks, the sacrament of the casserole, you know, the phone trees, the prayer phone trees. And you know what else I've been thinking about since I made this slide? Singing together. And that is something people actually long for. My husband Ron can tell you about beer and hymns. So beer and hymns, it's kind of a thing. You know, some pubs will do this, some Friday night or whatever, they'll have a night and somebody will come in and play piano, or a bunch of musicians will come in. And, you know, out of the sort of proverbial woodwork will crawl all these people who've been traumatized and left church. but they want to sing. They want to sing together, and they want to sing those old hymns about the blood of Christ and the whole bit. That is something that's a gift. That's an asset that we have, making music together. Other than a Taylor Swift concert, I mean, when do people sing together? Yeah. So I think that to consider those beautiful gifts and to think about how we can steward those, how can we enfold non-members in this? How can we think of nodes into networks again? How can we let these skills and assets draw those lines outside from our little sphere, our little node, and draw non-members in, not so we can, get them to sit in our pews and pay their tithes, but so that we can serve. How can we nurture our refugia practices, our casseroles, and our intergenerational community and our singing together? How can we help that to spread? So here's another one we've been thinking about, and we talked about this quite a bit Wednesday night with the BTS staff, the importance of ritual. Faith communities are actually really good at ritual. And ritual is something so important and so precious. People will make rituals if they are not given rituals. They will make them. Have you been to weddings? People make up the weirdest stuff to do at weddings. And here's another example of how desperately we need ritual. Our daughter is a doctor, and when she entered medical school, they do this white coat ceremony thing. Yeah, which is cool. They're trying to have a ritual. It's a great idea. So we went to our daughter's. It was so bad. Like people just, what are you doing? I mean, Brown and I, they don't know how, Brown and I were just sitting there, tapping our toes going, oh, this could be so much better. Yeah. But we are stewards of symbol and mystery, and our rituals are the way that we enact, embodied way that we enact, and not just sort of understand mystery. It's supra-rational. Rituals hold us amid upheaval. You notice we have these rituals for funerals and times of, pain and suffering and grief. We know how to do these things, or at least we should. So rituals participate in transcendence beyond words. And we need to get back to that because we have, I think, depended too much on rationality post-Enlightenment. And, many wise people are saying that has gotten you into trouble. So sacramental practice, moreover, forms a sacramental worldview. We are reminded that this world is precious when we use things like bread and wine and water as means of grace, as means of connecting with transcendence. So the question I think for us is, how can we share the beauty of our ritual practices beyond our little spheres? So maybe some of you have seen these folks who on Ash Wednesday will go out on the street and offer the ashes to just anybody. And you'll see these, and people are into it. Like, we're going to tell you you're dust and you're going to die. This is how much people want ritual, right? But it's an acknowledgement of something deep and mysterious that really nothing else in their lives necessarily acknowledges honestly. And it's embodied and it's personal. So I wonder if we can think about that. Okay, what else have we got? Well, we got buildings, some of us. How many of you have a big red door Episcopal Church building? Oh, there you go, the big red door. We have places in the community already. We have connections. People in our faith groups are connected through their professions, through their hobbies and interests. Some of us have a literal physical place in a community that costs a lot of money and we want to sell. But that too is an asset, and not just in the, dollar sign sense. It's a place, it's a literal node in a network. Many faith groups have a long, long history of a heart for justice and action for justice and connections through which to do that. Many of us do have a tradition of speaking into public spaces with moral witness and action. And the opportunities for that are abundant and much needed. And then, of course, actual places, buildings and grounds. And there are things you can do with your buildings and grounds that we can talk about more specifically. So that actual physical space is another way to build that node network. So here's a couple examples of people who are doing this really well, I think. This is a church in Granville, Michigan, and they are called the Refuge Church. They chose that name having nothing to do with me. And it's a big building that some donor donated, in 1940 or something, huge building. And the pastor came there, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. And of course, it was the same story, right? The membership had gone down, and it's right in the middle of this sort of highway crossing, and it's a terrible spot. But he said, we need to rethink our mission as a congregation. And through a period of discernment, they decided they were going to focus on only three things. So they were going to focus on refugees, particularly East African refugees. And so they have there's an East African immigrant pastor who lives in the parsonage now, and they support him shepherding East African refugee congregation. So they are partnering with that. The pastor has 2 children with disabilities, so the church decided we're going to focus on disabilities inclusion. So that's how their worship is structured. And then they call it outdoor discipleship. They were going to do citizen science. So they have a stream on their property that was very polluted, and they have taught their youth group how to do macroinvertebrate studies. So that's what you do in youth group. I mean, you look for bugs. Isn't that awesome? So they're not trying to do a million things. They're focusing on 3 things that they have discerned are needs in their community, that they have the assets, not necessarily money, that they have the assets to do. They do have this big old building. That's one of their assets. Now they've slapped a whole bunch of solar panels on the roof. But they have had to make partnerships with scientists in the community to figure out what they can do to help that stream and where it goes, where the downstream is. And anyway, it's just a great example of a church that has figured out how to be a node in a network. Now, I will tell you, they lost a lot of members at first because not everybody wanted to do this. A lot of people wanted the way it was, and they couldn't have that. So they went to other churches. Grand Rapids is full of churches. But now they're growing again, and not that that's the metric. The metric is they're doing something really meaningful, and their mission is needed, and they're serving not just themselves, but the community. I'll share this one too. This is actually not a congregation, and I think it's important for us not to always think of congregations as the unit, because I think that might change. The forms of how we form ourselves as people of faith might change, and I don't know what that's going to look like. So this is just an example of my university, which is a Christian university. And we have for a very long time, 15 years at least, maybe 20, been involved in healing our watershed. We are living in the Plaster Creek watershed. This was originally the land of the Odawa and the Potawatomi. And the Plaster Creek was it was a sacred place to the Odawa people, and it was dreadfully polluted by the gypsum mining industry. It's a very sad story. So when my colleagues figured out how polluted the creek was, I mean, to the point where you really couldn't put your skin in it, it was dangerous even to come in contact with the water. They decided they were going to do watershed work. And so this has become a whole long haul project of ecosystem restoration and community outreach. So they do community education, they do research. So our students go out there, once again, in their waders with their little straining nets and stuff and their test tubes. And they're trying to make the Plaster Creek healed and make it into a refugia space so that it is healthy once again. And I think what's interesting about this, this is a book that just came out by 2 of my colleagues. Dave Warner's is a biologist. Gail Gunst-Hefner is like a sociologist and a community leadership expert. And what they discovered is that you can't just fix the water. You have to fix all the relationships that led to the poisoned water. Or if not fix, you have to address. So they did all kinds of oral history and tried to partner with people from all sociostrata in the region and figure out what happened. So this book, it's a fascinating book because it goes into the geological history. So you start with like glaciers and then the indigenous history. So recovering that indigenous history is part of the healing, recovering and communicating that indigenous history, and then being honest about the settler history. And then you have to talk about plant biology and hydrology. There's little diagrams of like how the sewer system worked in Grand Rapids 40 years ago. Sociology, how is it, who lives there now, who is damaged by it, who is and then environmental justice. I mean, what's interesting to me is the interdisciplinarity of this reconciliation work. So they have called this reconciliation ecology. It's not just restoration ecology, reconciliation ecology, and it's all about relationship. And I think that's a really good model for how we think about this. And you've seen this slide before. This is our friend Dave, who does the literal redeeming of land. And I just want to emphasize again, what it took to do this is community partnerships. So Pastor Dave had to get out of his lane as a seminary graduate, which is great, and learn about stuff like bulldozers and DNR permits. And he had to make friends with these people. And he reports that, you know, calling up the DNR and going, yeah, I'm Pastor Dave, and we bought this piece of land, and we wonder if you can help us. And the DNR people going, you're what? Pastor what? They're not used to church people doing this kind of work because they're used to church people staying in their lanes. Okay, here's the part. I think this, Dan, is this for you? Was you the one who was telling me yesterday we need to talk about advocacy? Who was that? I don't know. Okay. Anyway, yeah. So one of the questions you might have is, okay, well, this refugee stuff is all very nice, but look, we have systemic needs, and we mentioned this yesterday too. So I think yes, part of refugee work is big scale advocacy work. That's only part of it. And I think some people are really gifted for this, and not everybody is gifted for this. We can all participate, but some people are just more movers and shakers in this area than others, and that's great. Multiple gifts. And once again, we have assets of people in our faith communities that are really good at this kind of work. If any of you are members of Third Act by any chance, so this is, yeah, Third Act has a faith subgroup that I'm a part of too. And these are people who are active in their home communities, but they're also making these connections. So this is part of building that vast social network, that vast social fabric. And yes, it's absolutely important that we not just heal our little watersheds, but also go upstream, literally and figuratively, to the big systemic and policy needs that have to be changed. So our personal virtue is important, sure. Our communal virtue is important, but ultimately this is about major systemic change. So we do our experiments, we do our important, significant, small scale work, but we also have to draw those lines to the big scale needs. And there are, of course, a million ways to do that too. All right, so how do we begin? I just made the whole thing a lot more complicated. Well, one thing to think about is where we begin emotionally. And I think that's really significant. And maybe this is one of the first discernments you might do. I know the BTS Center is really working on this. What is it called? Something Your Call? Claiming Your Call. Yeah. So some of you have been through this process. They're brilliantly figuring out how to do this with faith groups. And I think it's important to acknowledge that we begin in different places. Sorrow, longing, fear, anger, maybe those are very common ones. Reason, less common. Actually, I have to admit that's kind of where I began, because I don't know, maybe that's not fair, but I came to all this through reading and thinking logically, why, yes, I am convinced by the evidence. But I think I wouldn't have bothered to be convinced if I didn't have underneath love for this place that I grew up, love for the landscapes and flora and fauna of West Michigan. And so, you know, ultimately, I think love has to be at the center. Love is the most motivating thing. And love is a place where we can sink all those other things, sink our anger, sink our fear, and let that love turn those emotional beginning points into something useful. And I think excitement. is maybe an underrated place to begin. I am excited about a vision for a new way of living together. I know it's going to be hard. I know a lot of it is uncertain, but as we see it emerging, I feel excitement. And I think that's a really good place maybe to invite the more reluctant folks. Listen, it's not just going to be about never ever using a plastic bag again. You can live with that, right? There's excitement in building this new way of living together. Okay, let's get practical now. So once you sort of do that kind of emotional where are we thing, then there are a lot of places that different faith groups can begin, depending on what you discern as your context, what needs healing around you, and what assets do you have. And those assets might have dollar signs behind them, but maybe not. And maybe that's completely irrelevant unless you get a Lilly grant. So there's lots of ways to think about this. Advocacy, of course, I just mentioned that. If you are living in a place that is going to and already be affected by climate impacts, resilience planning is going to be important for you. Can your church building be a cooling center? Can it be a place where people can get water? How are you going to help your community live out flooding? Resilience planning. Education and formation. This is a really important one too, and I mean this for adults and children. What are you teaching? What does your Sunday school look like? Could you use a curriculum that gets them outdoors? Could you evoke in young people a love for place in an informed way? Could you partner with other people to do that? Partnerships, land, water, pollution, food security. This is the environmental justice part. And there again, I think it's really useful to choose a couple things. You know, I mentioned green teams yesterday at churches, and I hope I didn't sound too dismissive about that. Green teams can form leadership structures in a church and sort of do the trailblazing research work, like what needs helping around here. And then you have to activate that emotion circle in order to get people excited about, let's do this project and let's partner with other faith groups. Interfaith groups. Awesome. Nodes in a network. Let's partner with our local municipalities to do this work together. And then building and grounds. There's lots of things you can do with your building and grounds. There's, of course, energy conservation and solar panels. And not just because it saves your church money, but because it models for your whole community. And maybe eventually, your solar panel, you could be part of a distributed generation, if you know what that means, where we create local energy generation that kind of moves around the local grid rather than just drawing energy from some big solar farm elsewhere. Churches have roofs often, and they can be part of that distributed generation. Money, what are you doing with your money? If you have any, what are you doing with it? Where's it invested? So that can be an issue of moral consideration. So there might be 7 or more pathways of action. And I think that the task is just to figure out what buckets you already care about and where the leaks are from using that model yesterday or that analogy yesterday. So just to remind us of the sort of practical task list of climate mitigation and adaptation, and this is not necessarily a church-related one, but it's sort of our whole overall, human task list right now. Sharply reduce greenhouse gas emissions, phase out fossil fuels and transition, reverse biodiversity loss. That's a good one. If you have any property, you can work with community partners and figure out how your property could be a little actual refugia in that effort. Reform land use practices and policies. That's especially true of agriculture if you live in an agricultural community. Transition to more circular economies. That's where light bulbs and waste management fits in, where we try to reduce that waste production. And then justly, equitably, and fast. And that's true also where faith communities can really, really partner with the witness, the moral witness of our roles that our roles afford us in our communities. And then a reminder of what I said yesterday, doing things is how you find hope and how you find community, and not just community as you work together. Everybody knows it's way more fun with your faith group to be doing something rather than just sitting around. I don't know, I'd much rather be in the church kitchen or at the church mobile food pantry than sitting around in a circle of chairs talking in a committee meeting, right? Yeah, that to me, I guess that builds community, but I'd rather be doing something. And doing something, I think, brings joy. So here, yes, here's Willie James Jennings. Hope is a discipline to which God calls us. And then I'll add another one, a little spicier one by Kathleen Dean Moore. The paradox of hope as we move beyond empty optimism and choose to live the lives we believe in. Hope becomes transformed into something else entirely. It becomes stubborn, defiant courage. It becomes principled clarity. And we have so many amazing models of people of faith who have reached that point, and we can follow in their footsteps. So here's another one, Jim Antal, another inspiring quote for you. Reverend Jim Antal, UCC person who's been involved in climate work since the first Earth Day in 1970. And I think he comes back to this question of where are we in history? What is our moment? The call to address the climate crisis, he says, is a communal call. I love that, a communal vocation. So we all search for our vocations, but a communal vocation for all of us in this generation, a universal call. The climate crisis places an inescapable moral claim on our generation and therefore on every one of us. A generational call. I just found that so intriguing when I first heard this, and now I've really adopted this. It urges our generation to embrace a fresh understanding of human freedom, fulfillment, vocation, and salvation. So we have a lot of work to do, and these are some discussion questions. Oops. You can think about on your own. We won't do this right this second. How are you already doing refugio work? I understand some of you talked about that yesterday a little bit in one of your immersion sessions. How might thinking about your work as Refugia Nurturing change your thinking, feeling, and action? And here's the big question that I'm really trying to work on and hope that you can help me in some way. What does your faith community bring to the great work that is distinctive? What are our transferable skills as faith communities for this moment, for our communal call at this moment? Thanks again very much for your participation.
But thank you so much. Are we on? Okay. Deborah, thank you. We have just a few minutes for a little brief conversation, and I want to thank you so much for workshopping that around with us.
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like this is good stuff. What do you think?
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you. Good.
So thank you for sharing all those thoughts. You said that there are some benefits to being small. Mm-hmm. There are some things that small churches can do that larger churches can't do as well. I'm going to take a guess that everyone in this room who's part of a faith community is probably part of a small faith community. If there's anyone in the room who's part of a mega church, I would love to know that. But I didn't think so. Even if you think of yourself as part of kind of a medium-sized church, in the grand scheme of things, it's a small church. Because most churches in New England are small, and I know we have a few people beyond New England. And what I want to say is, at the BTS Center, we believe that this is a moment when we need small, healthy, imaginative, resilient, trauma-informed, ecologically grounded church in every city, town, hamlet, suburb in the world. We need you, and we need you to be at your very best. And one thing I wanted to just add that I've been thinking a lot about, in addition to all the other things that you named, is the reality of human migration. In New England, this is something we especially have to pay attention to because there are parts of our own country that are going to be uninhabitable, probably within some of our lifetimes. And New England, especially inland New England, is going to be a very welcoming, habitable place. So this is something that I do think we all need to be thinking about. We met with someone who works for disaster response for one of the big denominations a couple of weeks ago, and what they said to us was that even if we manage to close off all the borders, which we're not going to do, we're still going to see hundreds of thousands of people within our own country moving. And we're already beginning to see that. So in New England, I think we have to be thinking about what does it mean to welcome the stranger, whether that's someone from another state in our own country or from another country. And I do think that this is a contribution that small churches can make, that to be places of welcome. That casserole ministry can come in really handy when there are people showing up, or there's a natural disaster in your own community. And if it hasn't happened yet, it's going to happen. So how are you preparing to be spaces that can welcome people to take a shower, to have some warm meals, that sort of thing? So I wonder what word of encouragement you might want to offer to leaders of small churches who are in this room right now and who are with us in our online companions, who are wondering, like, do we have a role to play? Like, what word of encouragement would you offer to them? Because I feel like very often we feel like we don't have what it takes.
Good. I don't know what I'm talking about. I honestly, I don't think of myself as an expert. I think of myself as a really keen public listener and a public learner. And then I listen to what people say and I read a million books and then I write it and put in the commas and then I share it with you. So it's easy for me to say, oh, it's going to be great. But I think it's still going to be hard. But I think my word of encouragement is that we all have more to work with than we think we do. We have people in our churches who have gifts and talents that we don't realize, and they're not necessarily obvious. They might be the gift of hospitality. They might be the gift of deep patience and listening with people who are different or troubled. We don't always know. And you're right, internal migration is definitely going to happen. And Michigan is in the same boat. We're probably really quite insulated from the worst stuff that's going on. A couple years ago, Gretchen Whitmer, our governor, was saying, we need to bring more people to Michigan. And I just said, oh, honey, it's going to happen. People are going to start buying property. The other thing I think we can do with regard to migration is be firm witnesses about the biblical call to hospitality for the alien and the sojourner, as some of the translations say. And you see in the news that when people are fearful, and I think Mariamo is absolutely right, a lot of the ugliness we see deep underneath that is fear. That's the emotional spot on that little circle. Deep underneath that is fear that somebody's going to come and take away my good stuff. And so you see this anti-immigrant, it's just obscene and grotesque, isn't it? This anti-immigrant sentiment. So as church communities, even small ones, to model welcome and to witness to that fundamental biblical principle of hospitality, we steward that. So however we want to model and insist on that, I think that will be a really important role that faith communities will play, and not just Christian faith communities.
Thank you. I wanted to return just for a minute to the PRRI data that you shared. And as you were sharing that graph, I was thinking about another book that I've read, which some of you may have read also, which is Diana Butler Bass's book, Grounded. Anybody read Grounded? So in that book, she talks about some of the same data. 1 in 4 Americans is not affiliated with any church. And I would guess in Maine, that's probably more like 1 in 2. Maybe that's a hopeful estimate. Over the last decade, something like 700,000 Americans have said they're done with church every year for the last decade or so. But what Diana Butler Bass says in that book is that what we might think of as decline is actually kind of an interesting transformation that's happening, because people are coming to new understandings of how they can experience God. So just like people feel like they can grow their own vegetables, knit their own blankets, brew their own beer, make their own playlists, shop local, all these things, they also are taking agency in their own spiritual and theological exploration. And what she sees is happening is this great transformation where people are beginning to understand that God is actually in the ground. God is what grounds us. And I would say largely because the church is not paying attention to what's outside the church building. They're finding that in other ways. So here's what she said. I just want to share this, this quote. She calls this a great sacred revolution. And she writes, and this revolution rests upon a simple insight. God is in the ground, the grounding, that which grounds us. We experience this when we understand that soil is holy, water gives life, the sky opens the imagination, our roots matter, home is a divine place, and our lives are linked with our neighbors and with those around the globe. This world, not heaven, is the sacred stage of our times. So when I take, sort of those ideas and match them up against the PRRI data, I wonder, is there an invitation here? Is there an invitation here for the church?
Yeah, and I think our I don't know, maybe this is generalizing, but our former ways of thinking, if we bring people in, that means they turn up for worship and they tithe, right?
And they teach Sunday school and they serve on 27 committees.
Absolutely. But if we think of our role more as serving than bringing people in, and once again, we're going to need Lilly grants to fund this. If we think of our role as serving, we can think maybe about, once again, I think at the end of her book, she has this phrase, which I really love, called sacramental cosmopolitanism. Isn't that good? And I think as we steward our big meaning-making stories and our sacraments, maybe this is what I always come up with. What we need is better sacramental worship. We steward our sacraments in a way that shows people we get this idea that the holy is not ethereal and out there and up there, but it's distilled within these symbols that actually resonate with all of creation. The water, the bread, the wine, the oil, yeah. If we are able to convey that that's the distillation of our acknowledgement that we are embodied creatures, we have to pull back from that post-Enlightenment individualism and over-spiritualization, and go back around that to a much more grounded faith. If we can model that, I'm not saying people will come into our pews and tithe, but at least we will feel like we are offering something, a treasure that we are sharing with folks. Because even though they're unaffiliated, they still have those needs. They still have those needs for transcendence and community and a sense of meaning about who they are as bodies on a planet with minds and souls. They still have those needs. It's just they're kind of done with all the folderol of church structures, and I get that. But ultimately, that kind of individualistic niche spirituality, it doesn't really satisfy ultimately. So I don't know how to hold out a space of welcome, and to communicate that we are people who have this kind of sacramental cosmopolitan. I don't know. If you have ideas, let me know. But I feel like that's what we have to do. I just don't know exactly what that looks like.
Thanks for floating that question around with me. Online companions, Deborah and I will be with you to continue our conversation at 1 o'clock. The rest of you will have a chance to watch the recording of that if you want. But I'm going to turn it back to Nicole for some announcements, or Josh. Josh, let's sing, and then we're going to have some wrap up and then on to the next thing.